Okay. Oh, there we go. All right.
There we go.
Welcome, everyone, to the first episode or endeavor of the FlyOverThinkers. Um, because we're overthinkers. No, it's because we're all from Midwest states, or actually, we're all from Indiana, and which is a flyover state, like the definition of a flyover state. I love whenever I go some other places and I talk to people like, "Oh yeah, I'm originally from Indiana. Yeah, I don't live there now, but I'm originally from Indiana." They're like, "Oh, I drove through there once." Like that's always like the common response, or like I was in like the airport or some shit like that. Like that's all they ever say. Like no one ever says anything nice about it. It's like, oh, there's stuff. I don't know, or they like racing. One of the two.
Our three big exports: the Indy 500, corn, and methamphetamine.
And racist. Didn't the KKK start in Martinsville? I'm
It might
pretty
not have
sure.
started, it didn't start, but it was definitely one of the most prominent areas of it in the early 20th century.
Yeah, because they had a mural there for the longest time in one of their public buildings that like had KKK members on it or something like that. Anyway, nothing to drill on it. I'm Josh Corum. Sorry, we'll dive into that. I'm Josh Corum, and with us we have John Paulson and Eric Johnson, as always. Howdy, guys. So,
How's it going?
Bryce, we want to dive into this. So this is just three dudes talking about weird shit or fun shit in society, and one of the things that
Weird shit, fun shit, and societal shit, and it all goes together.
and societal shit. That's right. That's right. So with that, one of the things that popped up was that, and it is that like step forward, step back privilege thing that came out, right? And I think Eric, you posted this on your Facebook, and you got some responses from it. And I just thought that would be like a really interesting thing to talk about, to kind of break down some of these things. And for those of you who don't know, this is actually what's called a privilege walk. I believe it's a derivative of Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking of White Privilege. I think that essay. So it's kind of built around that, and then these exercises. And they made a video not too long ago where it's like they had a bunch of high school kids out in the field, and this guy was like giving these, like, take 2 steps forward if blah blah blah, and 2 steps, and then all the white kids make it up front, and they look back, and all the black kids are, which wasn't true. There were white kids back there as well, and I don't know. I have issues with that video to begin with, but so that's the idea, and it's this 19 question. Well, actually, no. There's 2 sets of 19 questions, right? Step forward and step back. Actually, hold on. I think I can. Let me do this real fast. So we'll do this, right? It looked like this, right? So this is going to show, right? So it looked like this. It was all these questions, stuff like that. So I thought we could dive into discussing that. You guys switch sides on me. Holy shit. All right. What do you guys think? Dive in. First off, did you do the test?
I did. My privilege landed me 4 steps back, so I feel very fortunate for that.
Well, what were your steps back or forward? Did you have any, or you were saying they were balanced out like that?
Well, I had 4 steps forward and 8 back, so that was the results of my privilege test there. So.
John.
What, and take 2 steps back if you can't do the math to figure that out, and I have to take 2 steps back. So, I've watched the video. I didn't actually take the test. I hadn't seen the actual sort of questions put that way, so I don't have my calculation.
It's okay. I just wanted to know. So John took no steps either direction, which I understand. I had 10 steps forward and 13 steps back, so I'm at a deficit of 3, which I thought was interesting. But
yeah, I posted that,
anyway.
and I didn't get as much engagement as I hoped for. It seems that a lot of people are hesitant to discuss this topic, and I'm guessing they don't want to discuss it because it would give opposition traction, is what it seems. That's
because you're discussing it gives opposition. Yeah, but I think it's important. I mean, we can discuss it in a very pragmatic way.
Yeah, and like I said, I understand the purpose of the exercise, but it's the way that it was worded, the formula that they used was it was ridiculous. Like it was designed to make white men look privileged, and a
Mhm.
lot of the things were like, if you feel this, take a step back. Like privilege has nothing to do with your feelings. You know, if your feelings are what makes you privileged, then that's a totally different test that they should have designed.
Mhm.
and and actually, I mean, I've thought quite a bit about this exercise. And so maybe the first thing I want to say is let me steel position it. So let me sort of like say what I find that's actually beneficial about it. Because obviously if it's used correctly, it's inviting us to think about the ways that different people, based on their backgrounds or experiences or heritages or identities, it's inviting us to think about the ways that those have often led people to be treated in a disadvantageous way. Sometimes vastly so, to the point of oppression. And I think we can all have a sense of a perspective on that and empathy with it. I mean, that's when it's done correctly. I think that's a good reminder. But what really bothers me about the exercise is, so they're using this analogy of a race. And basically what they're suggesting is that if you have certain characteristics or a certain heritage or certain experiences, then you are either fundamentally, almost irreversibly disadvantaged, and that other people in a very unfair and unjust way have been put towards the front of the line and they're cheating. I mean, if we use this analogy of a
Mhm.
race, I mean, that's sort of the idea here. And what really sticks out to me, though, is that this is where the analogy breaks down. Life isn't a race. And it's not a race between competing identity groups. Now, that's the idea that comes out of conflict theory of you have to have these groups fighting each other. But life is not a race. Yes, certain people have had unfortunate circumstances, been disadvantaged, have been subject to horrendous oppression. We can acknowledge all of that. We shouldn't ignore it. But this idea that somehow this is a race. And so, in fact, the thing that makes me think of is, if we want to stick with the race analogy, is that life is not a race between these groups. It's a race where you're racing against yourself to try to run your best race. And what the rest of us can do is to try to do our best to help you to do your best, whether that's with your training, with training gear, by cheering you on. It doesn't have to be that we're competing against others. It's that each of us are trying to find our best performance. And at least that's the way that I would hope that we can eventually get to, is how can I help you to succeed and be the best version of you? Because the better you do, the better I do, and vice versa, because of our interconnectedness. So instead of this worldview that says this is nothing but oppressor versus oppressed, this group is trying to belittle and attack this group, at the end of the day that goes nowhere. It goes nowhere productive. So that's, to me, why I don't like this race exercise, because they're trying to send this signal of, well, the race is unfair from the very get-go and certain people are set up to win over others. It's not about competing against each other. It's not about winning.
Yeah.
So that's my main issue with that exercise.
I agree. And that, well, I actually taught this video one time in a sociology class, and that was my big critique: is that there's no finish line. It's like a false flag finish line. There's no end to this. Death, that's the finish line. You die. Like, there's no end. And also, like, yeah, these are like starting positions. Rarely do we talk about the things that happen along the way. Like, we regardless of what you say about, say, the wage gap, we'll talk about that. I think it's actually a misnomer. It should be an earn gap, but we'll call it a wage gap just for the point is. But if we're looking at women along the way, they run into snags, right? They run into, I'm going to potentially have a child, or, they're going to run into these life things that are going to slow them down. And that becomes something that is inhibiting later, like men in, not to red pill it, but men in divorce, like you potentially lose money, you potentially lose assets. Like those are roads or roadblocks that you run into in the middle of the so-called race. So they're not right. They're not these privileges necessarily that you have. And I agree. It kind of positions people outside of. I'm more of like a class guy. I like to analyze class, and I feel like this is more class than race. There were a couple things they tried to throw in there that were race. Like one was specifically race. If you were of these races, then you have to take a step back. And I kind of bristled at that because they lumped a bunch together. I think it was number 3 where they press it back. And if I can look at it right, it's like if you are Black, Latina, Native American, Indian, Asian, Arab, or Middle Eastern descent. That's a lot. Like
basically, if you do not come from a European ancestry, take a step back.
Right. But evidence is showing now that, if you're Asian or Indian or even some like truly from Africa or Afro Caribbean, you actually do the same, if not better, than the supposed white folk do. And we're like, I bristle at lumping all white folks together because oftentimes they'll lump like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos in that group, which like skews the data really high. So you do see certain racial groups, Asians and Indians particularly, that actually show they do better economically speaking. So I feel like to really do this correctly, this needs to be a more class analysis and not sprinkled with race and identity politics. I think that would give a better indicator of like certain privileges and things like that.
It is. If I can say something asinine, for a minute, and then something serious, is that one thing I could say is, well, Josh, of course you can say that it's about class more than anything else, and that's because you're a white male, so you can't see past your privilege and power and positionality. So, but I'm being facetious. But I'm with you, because actually I tend to view it a lot more along class also. And I think that actually one of the reasons, not the only one, I think maybe one of the reasons why each of us sort of does that is because we all grew up in an area that actually had a significant amount of poverty. And none of us grew up affluent, wealthy, all very lower working, class kind of deal. So we actually can see that impact of social class and all that. And that's always sort of like been one of my guiding features, because I tend to have a suspiciousness of the super wealthy, kind of the super upper class. And it doesn't matter to me what their ethnicity is. I'm sort of suspicious of them because of class issues.
Right. And oftentimes when we're talking about things like you mentioned critical theory and even things like critical race theory, this idea of intersectionality, oftentimes in the US particularly, class is left out of that. It's race, it's gender, it's sex, religion, ableism, but a lot of times class is like, man, I don't really want to, because a lot of times when you look through that lens of class, I've always said that a lot of our racial issues, our concept of racial issues, if we can fix like economic inequalities across the board, class inequalities, a lot of the racial issues that we have will be satiated, or what we see as racial issues will be dealt with. Did we lose Eric?
No, I had a little lag there for a second.
Oh, I don't know. What do you think, Eric? What's your take on it?
Well, I think a lot of the mainstream narrative has to push for a side, and if you're not taking a side, like you're either privileged or you're a victim. You're either one of those two things. You're either a hero or a villain. They're just encouraging to take a stance, and you're either the problem or you're the solution, and they're just screaming into the void right now about race. And I'm with you on the class thing. Like, I grew up super poor, and to me, my idea of wealth when I was growing up, just being a kid. Like, I couldn't afford to play sports. So like if kids were in sports, I'm like, they must have rich parents. They can play sports, they can participate in these things. And so yeah, there was quite a bit of a difference in the way I grew up. So like on this little privilege chart thing, I just found it to be kind of nonsense. It's like I said, I understand the idea behind it, and bringing attention to that sort of thing, but the way that it was set up, it was just silly.
And to me, I think one of the other things that I react to, like with the example of using the privilege or oppression race, whatever you want to call this, the take these steps, is that now I believe that all sides are guilty of this. Now, that being said, I think most recently that a particular side tends to excessively rely on these anecdotes, but there also seems to be this overuse of these short little representations, analogies, illustrations that are meant to try to sell people and get them to go, oh yeah, well that sounds right, and then people don't think of it. Because as I was thinking about us talking about the race example tonight, it also made me think about that picture that has just been shared significantly of the three kids, and it's used to illustrate equity, which is this horrible concept, in my opinion. But you see it, and so you've got this super tall kid, kind of a shorter kid, and a very shorter kid, and they're trying to look over the fence into the stadium and watch the baseball game. They each have one box. But even with the one box, the kid that's tall gets a really good view. The other kid's barely over the fence, and then the small kid, even with the box, can't see in. So the final picture shows that the other ones have, given their box to the short kid so the short kid can see it. And it's like, oh, well, doesn't that seem fair? And the first thought that comes to me is, that's not equity, that's compassion. That's looking out for the struggle of others, especially if you care about them and trying to help them out. But then my kind of like my critical sense goes, wait a second, what are these kids doing trying to sneak into a stadium? You look in the picture and there's like the fans, the stands are full. This is not like a little league game. This looks like it could be like a big game. And it's like, these kids, they should find a way to get or earn money to get a ticket. So maybe instead of giving them boxes, let's figure out a way for them to try to figure out how to get a seat in the park. That's the same thing. There's a scholar whose name escapes me, who I probably wouldn't use their name anyway because I don't like their views. But they use this as an analogy, which is trying to talk about equity or equality. And they go, well, equality is giving everyone a pair of shoes. Equity is giving them a pair of shoes that fit. And I'm like, no, actually what equality is let's continue to try to do our best to create the circumstances that allow people to work towards and earn and choose the shoes they want. Don't give them shoes. Allow them the opportunity to succeed and to pursue the shoes they want. And maybe they don't want shoes. Maybe they want boots. So maybe they'll choose shoes. Maybe they'll choose boots. Maybe they'll choose sandals. I don't know. But equality comes, can we help build better circumstances that allow people to succeed through their investment and effort? So to me, all these examples of the shoes, of the kids trying to look into the stadium, of the race, these are all incredibly simple and reductionist, but they have an appeal. They have an appeal for people that maybe aren't thinking through them. So I think that's what bothers me about them.
Right. My favorite spoof of that is I forgot exactly the type of equality they called it, but basically they chopped everyone's legs off. So they were all the same height, but because all of them just had different length of legs, so they just cut everybody's legs off. It was like modern like capitalist something equality. Yeah. So you hit on a couple points there that I want to talk about, and I think, and I keep going back to this because in sociology, we have feminist thinkers and we have racial thinkers and all of this stuff, and we have different methods that are being used, and you see this a lot. And I think what's interesting about this is you mentioned the narratives or the anecdotal components. And what I'm finding is, and I think we talked about this at lunch the other day, is like the rejection of like Western ideals, right? Western research, even to the point of Western science, because it's considered, that's like the extreme view, is the resistance to Western ideology, which I understand. And I think this goes along with it. You have, because in a lot of those other cultures, storytelling and anecdote are a big part of their culture. And that's something that in the West Coast, like Western Europe ideology or Western European ideology, we have storytelling, but we rely a lot on science because we had our Enlightenment and the Renaissance, right? So we go to science to answer questions for us, where a lot of other cultures didn't have that. So they rely on storytelling to tell their history, to tell how things work, to tell their customs and their traditions. And I think with that comes a reliance on anecdotes. And I think this is kind of the key too, like the frustration we have with this. When we're looking at things like this, like we'll use statistics a lot of times. Western Europe or Western European ideology will use statistics, whereas other cultures might use anecdotes, right? So ethnography and autoethnography and stuff like that they feel has more salience in their explanation for things. And basically we're having this weird tug of war between what is truth in that. And I think for a lot of this idea of privilege and this idea of, say, statistics versus ethnography or anecdotal information, like, is this tug of war between what's true and what's not with in regards to privilege and things like that.
Here's always two, like, so two things I want to say. One of them is, because you're right, but when it comes to story or narrative, not that the three of us have ever been in this situation before at all, but let's just say somebody might have either been drunk at a bar or been around drunk people at a bar, and listening to them tell stories, you eventually kind of like have to list this and go, bullshit. It's like the story sort of like falls away. So I think that also kind of goes into maybe our own tradition, is that we have become suspect of stories over, like you said, Josh, over like data and other things. And now that can be some good, not so good, because actually, again, if we're trying to steal position of personal perspective, individual experience, to use a research term, more of that qualitative based data, it's not that doesn't have a place. In fact, and so I think all of us, not just three of us, we have to watch out to make sure, like you said, maybe not to discount or exclude that automatically, because it has richness, it has wisdom, it has merit. And so maybe we don't do enough of acknowledging that. But again, I think one thing that I tend to react to with the other side, and I'm not saying that I support this guy or his views at all, but I remember watching a clip once where when Chris Christie was the governor of New Jersey, I think it was, and there was an issue that had to come down to like funding like schools and things like that. And there was this teacher that got up and actually said, almost to this words, like, well, Governor Christie, I know you have your numbers, I know you have your charts, I know you have all this, but I need you to hear me and my story. And like all of a sudden, like her story is supposed to like, and he kind of made a point later. He's like, I feel for you. I'm not discounting that, but that doesn't make up for a budget deficit. It's like, it's almost like, a sense of, no, if it's my story, then it automatically is not only correct, but it should be privileged over other information. And so I think that that's the danger, is instead of kind of seeing the benefit of both qualitative and quantitative, there becomes this argument over which one, like you said, is the truth, or like, that should have the say. And that's sort of a place of some conflict where I find myself right now, because unfortunately I say that, but then when I hear people who kind of like, tout that line, I was in a meeting one time and this fellow professional said, well, I just want to make sure that we're not privileging any sources of information over others. And I felt like going, yes, we should, because some information is more privileged over others, And so, but I find myself kind of like getting fussy and pushing back when I hear almost too much of one side. Now, truth on the other side too. I'm not a complete quantitative guy, which is sort of like, well, hey, these are the numbers. Okay, yeah, but numbers tell us something, and they tell us an important something, but there might be some things they're not telling us. And so let's look to narrative and circumstance to expand those. So it's like I tend to, when somebody argues one of the sides, I find myself kind of going, and then like sort of like becoming the jackass who wants to kind of argue a position, even if it's not my full one.
Oh, I love to argue regardless if I'm right or wrong sometimes. Like I may be completely wrong, but I'll fight it to the death sometimes. It's like, no, it's this. I promise it's this, even though I don't actually believe it and I actually agree with you. But no, it's this. It's being contrarian just on purpose. I feel like Eric has a little bit of that sometimes.
Eric has a 5th degree black belt in being a contrarian.
I do actually. I'm pretty good at mental gymnastics, and I can play devil's advocate just to punch some holes in some theories. But you being on the topic of privilege, and you mentioned school budgets. I did some work for a gentleman in Southern Illinois that was on the school board down there, and he was explaining that he was battling to get his lunch program funding squared away, and he said that he couldn't get his determined until Chicago got theirs squared away. Now, he is in Southern Illinois. He said, come to find out that Chicago had 4 high schools that had sushi bars within the high schools, and he couldn't get funding for his little chicken nugget program. So as far as, systematic racism or privilege or whatever, I know a lot of areas school funding comes from surrounding property tax, which that is in it. I wouldn't say that system it is a flawed system, because the quality and the education that these people get is determined by where they live, and that's absolute garbage. And that's on a larger scale is what I saw in Illinois working for that gentleman, because Chicago is a cesspool, and everything that sucks about the state of Illinois is because of Chicago. But that's a totally different story for another episode.
No, you see that everywhere. I actually have a friend in Virginia who I forgot where they live, but they live like, in a normal town, but their state is essentially screwed over all the time by DC. Like everything is catered towards that DC area.
And Alexandria, Virginia, that's like right outside.
Yeah. That's what it is, Alexandria. So a lot of the stuff comes out of Alexandria, and a lot of the regulations, stuff like that, much like you're talking about Chicago. I feel like Indianapolis is one of those cities too that just gets screwed over by a lot. Like you have Carmel, and you have those very affluent areas up there. And then what I love about Indianapolis, I'm not a big fan of the city, but what I love about Indianapolis is it's not a city broken up by areas a lot. Like there are some rough areas, there are some nice areas, but like you can drive like, all right, so you're driving through the town, right? You'll pass 2 blocks that look pristine, and then like the next 2 blocks are like Mad Max. Like, and then the next 2 blocks are like a community garden. It's really bizarre. Like they're all over the place. And granted, there are some neighborhoods and areas, but you can drive like, it's this weird ebb and flow of that city.
It's like a high school with sushi. Man, we really missed out. Don't you remember whenever we had like the square slice of pizza day that like no pizza company ever makes pizza that looks like that? Or you got the chicken nuggets, or it was like a really big day whenever like you could buy French fries like on a Friday if you brought extra money. It's like that was like hot shit, let alone sushi.
Yeah.
Yeah, but would
It's,
you even eat it? Would you eat like school
sushi in high
cafeteria
school, but-
sushi? Like not like, oh, I didn't have a taste for it, but now that you're an adult and you've had sushi, like thinking about quality of sushi, would
It's
you
probably like gas station sushi. Yeah.
yeah, would you eat sushi from high school? Like, what, like it's like Cisco dropping off.
If I had my knowledge and perspective now, no. But I look back then and I ate steak nuggets and like bought extra steak nuggets to dip into what they called mashed potatoes. So I probably would have been like, oh, sushi, that sounds really good. And I'd like to say no, but I think I probably would have. Now, I don't know if I would have graduated then. Like you said, it might have had to lead to some homeschooling because of like a parasite, but now, no. Now looking back at the school, I'm just sort of surprised and grateful that I actually lived to graduate after all that cafeteria food.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the school funding thing, that's one aspect of government funding and how it's misused. Like most government funding has a use it or lose it policy when it comes to their budgets and things. A friend of mine owned a lawn care business, and he had put in a bid for the groundskeeping of Fort Knox, and it was I want to say it was like a $6 million a year contract or something, and he bid at like 5.3, and the company that ended up getting the bid was like 6.4. And when they explained that, he thought, oh, I'll just undercut, and get, I'll be sure to get the job because I'll do it for less, and it turns out the way they explained it was, if they're allotted a certain amount of money and they don't use that money, they don't get that money next year. So if a company comes in, they're like, oh, we'll do it for 6.4, then they have to get increased money. And then that kind of gives them more to work with next year if they get that approved instead of working. So it's never about efficiency. It's not about saving money. So that's just one of the other faulty.
So what you're saying is anytime you do a government contract is you should bid up.
Yes.
Punch up on your bids.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think kind of bringing this all back, you were mentioning property tax. I think class then plays this role, and again, it manifests into these racial issues that we're having. A lot of underprivileged schools, inner city schools, they don't get the same money because of the communities that they're in, and so community plays a big role. And a lot of times, you have affluence living with affluence and stuff like that. So it becomes, again, we're looking at this from this racial perspective when really we need to look at this from a class perspective rather than this race perspective, because then it will fix the issue of race. Because when you're looking at like methods, when you're looking at research methods, or you're looking at the ability to do a research project, it is incredibly difficult to research racism. Racism is not a quantifiable concept like specks of racism can be. You can see how often someone is discriminated, or if someone is discriminating, whether that happens or not. But actual racism as a concept is incredibly difficult to. You can't just ask somebody, "Are you racist? What's your level of racism, 1 to 10?" Are you like
you almost have to assess it by proxy, which
Right.
is we see this difference and that leads us to a conclusion that we can attribute that difference to race.
Right. So it's an extrapolation or a connection, oftentimes in the conclusion or what have you, and then you bring it back to the abstract, journal article there now. But economic inequality is relatively easy to research of sorts. It's a lot easier than the concept of racism. And I feel like if we can put more energy into examining that aspect, we can then impact things that are being defined as racist or systemic racism or things like that. Like, because we do have like this class issue and these economic struggles across the board and how they can be fixed.
Yep. And Eric, I mean, that's a great point, that you made. And I agree that the whole funding based on property taxes is flawed because it leads to these inequities, like Josh is saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking about this because two of the people that have become some of my public intellectual heroes over the past 2 years I listened to. It's a gentleman named Dr. John McWhorter and a gentleman named Dr. Glenn Lowry, who do this ongoing commentary about a lot of social issues. And especially Dr. Lowry, he's an economist. I mean, he teaches economics at Brown University. And as a significant scholar in economics, and he sort of points that out and about schools and about school choice. And recently, John McWhorter and others have been pointing out that here becomes the problem. So one of the solutions to this class issue, which would then also affect race, would be to improve schools and improve education. But now we even have to worry about that because there's all these concerns about some of these principles and ideas, and we could go so far as, like John McWhorter says, to call them beliefs, almost like religious ones, that now instead of teaching math and English, is that almost every class there's almost now this infusion of almost like related to the race we're talking about at the beginning of this. Like, okay, everybody stand up, and we're going to put you over here because you're white, and so we put you into the oppressor group, and you need to see these are the people that are oppressed. I mean, there's like grade schools where people are like, coming out and saying, this is what they're doing with my kids, this is what they're sending home. And a lot of people made the comment, not that we shouldn't, because then it's always a bait and switch. So every time this gets brought up, and several people in the media have said this, so it's not like my original idea. It's like you start bringing up issues about this, and they go, "Oh, well, you just don't want accurate history to be taught." I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying, we don't talk about, things that were horrendous. I mean, in fact, it's important for us to do that. But maybe you shouldn't be taking third graders and spending a lot of time, focusing on like this oppression hierarchy, type deal. So it would be ideal if we could then improve schools. That would be there. But then you also have to kind of worry about, okay, but now what are we sort of like considering to be the content and focus of education? So, but now that's a kind of a side point, but I agree. To me, one of the biggest answers that we could have would be, let's unhook funding for schools from property taxes so that you can take some of these underperforming schools that have don't have enough money, and let's get them up to where everybody's being successful. I mean, I think that's a good idea and a fairness right there.
Going back to, we were talking about the Western European, white guys that get lumped in to offset the statistics in our favor. It occurred to me that Elon Musk is African American, is he not?
That's right. He is African American.
So that might offset the numbers. I mean, Jeff Bezos, yeah, he's still, putting billions on the white guy scale, but does he identify as African American or?
Who, Elon? I have no idea. Sure, it shows up on his taxes. Oh wait, he probably doesn't write his taxes.
He probably identifies as an alien. I think that's why he's trying to shoot himself into space.
Yeah. Elon.
There we
alien.
go.
It's really close. I what were you saying, John? You were saying, lost my train of thought. That happens. Being in Vegas, edibles are legal. You kind of spend too much time having gummies. No,
it slows the synapses a bit.
Kind of sometimes. No, I'm we always talk about taxes and inequality and stuff like that. I was always a fan of that education. Like as a non-child having taxpayer, I don't mind education being a place where we bleed money. Like it doesn't. Granted, I've been a student for a long time, so I'm kind of invested in it. But I'm okay with us bleeding money. And unfortunately, I think what we're getting is, because it's become this like industry, right? This like just churning out students so we can get money, churning out students, lowest possible budget that we can create these students, get money from the government. We're going to pay admins a lot of money and teachers for shit. And I think that's what we're seeing is the effects of that. I would love to go back to where everyone had their own pedagogy. Everyone was allowed to teach whatever the hell they wanted under their subject. The kind of ideas that a blanket idea. We want these topics taught. Okay, you can do it however you want. And having these really revolutionary teachers who would do these really crazy things and really fun things, and like they were this like I'm really curious if, looking back, the students that are in high school now will look back and be like, oh, that teacher, I love them so much. Like, I feel like teachers' hands are tied so much that they're not able to connect like that, say, even whenever we were in high school, to teachers that really would impact our lives. And I feel like if we would just, throw money in the education system, as you said, dislodge it from property tax and pay teachers more, we're going to have a weird flux for a couple of years. But I think after everything's settled, they can now demand more from teachers. If you pay teachers $100,000 a year, you can demand more of their education. You can demand more of their character. You can demand more from them as people. And I think right now, even I think Indiana had an emergent a bill put where you can get a teaching certificate even if you didn't have any teaching degree. You just had to have a degree in something, and you got this emergency licensure to be able to, where you can go and teach. Okay, so that's no longer an issue. You have people who shouldn't be teaching that are teaching, and now you have a higher quality of teacher because they're being paid more, because you can demand it with a position like that. So students are getting a better education. The education overall, teachers are getting paid more. And I think that would really help a lot.
I agree. And then also, but let me kind of bring up a point of slight disagreement, is that, no, I agree with you that if you provided more resources, again, even if you unhitch those from property taxes, we give money that direction. Like you said, I don't care if we bleed money a little bit that direction too, because education's an investment worth it. But so, you do that, you kind of you make it more appealing, because right now you can get the emergency license, or there's been a program for several years now, because schools have a hard time finding and keeping STEM teachers, people to teach more science, engineering, mathematics, kind of things like that. And so what they have, these programs that will find people that don't have an education background, in teaching, but have a background in those fields. How can we kind of get you in the classroom quicker? Which again is sort of a good idea. So I definitely agree with you. My only sort of issue, and this is because of what I sort of am now kind of seeing, not so much exactly where I'm at, but sort of circling the periphery, is that now, because I always tell people, just real quick, I mean, maybe I'll eventually name it. Right now, I won't name the name of my university. And I guess I should say that all my views are my own. I don't speak for my university, kind of this deal. But it's one of those deals where I always tell people, I'm a professor. I'm not a teacher, because I never went through an education training program. I don't have a degree in education. The only thing that worries me now is that the schools of education, so the schools that are training teachers, have now been almost completely taken over by critical theory. So, critical education theory is almost now ascendant. The pedagogy of the oppressed. I can't think of the author who's attached to that, but there's kind of critical race theory is actually a textbook that is used by Delgado and others, as the deal. So now, unfortunately, as we're trying to, in our view, create better teachers, is that the education colleges are trying to create teachers that are more focused on liberation and revolution. to these ideas of, like we were talking about earlier, we have to get rid of math and the way we teach it, and we shouldn't have standards like this, and so again, not that some of that stuff shouldn't change, but so to me, you almost have to kind of balance it with, let's give more resources, but then we also have to have a recalibration of what we want to teach in schools. There was a guy who was at one of those school board meetings I was watching on the news where they're trying to speak out against stuff, and it was this black gentleman, and he made a really good point, because he was talking about like the way that his biracial daughter had been treated horribly by some staff at the school, and the school did nothing. And in fact, they put it back on her. He goes, listen, your job is to teach her and other students how to read and how to do math. And it's our job as parents to teach them how to do life, and I thought that was a really good point. So I think if we can sort of like, and maybe because all this kind of goes in cycles, the whole kind of social world and the academy has sort of gone batshit crazy. Who knows if that will last? Maybe it'll sort of come back. And if we sort of get back into sort of like what we would probably consider a productive, traditional emphasis in education, then I agree. Give more money to the schools, make sure teachers are a more prestigious profession, give more money. And I think that will actually solve some of the class and race issues.
Yeah.
Well, I think it kind of goes in opposite directions as far as like high school and college. They dump all this funding in for, high schools and grade schools and whatever, but on the opposite, on college, I mean, they put that on the students. I'd seen something that was pointing out, that a bank won't give an 18-year-old a $10,000 startup, like a business loan, but they have no problem doing $100,000 student loan, that they're obligated to pay back. Like, the IRS will rape you if you don't, like that's the government's money. You can't file bankruptcy on that,
No,
if you
used to be able to.
Yeah, if you fuck this up, you're in debt forever, and that's what systematic slavery looks like. It's not has nothing to do with racism. I've said it for years that slavery was never abolished; it was reinvented to include everyone. You get 12 years of school, and then you go back to school for so many that puts you in instant debt, that forces you to work off that debt, and it just keeps people busy. I mean, that's what slavery is you're a cog in this machine now, and that's your option. You're either going to be on government funding programs like welfare and what, we're either going to have you on this machine or the productive side. And sorry, my train of thought's my dog was barking back there. So yeah, like it's systematic slavery. It's not about a race anymore. It's, you're in this, we're all in this together, and it's a debt thing. So it's not really a race thing. But as far as schooling goes, yeah, you dump all the government funding into grade schools and high schools, and then they flip it and make the student responsible to this debt that can't be erased. When most kids that go to college, they have no idea what they're doing. They're going to fuck it up anyway, so they're going to accrue a bunch of debt that they're tied to. They've got grand plans of being something, and I'm going to take out all these loans, and I'm sure you've seen quite a bit of that. People can't commit to a major, and they'll take out all these loans for so many years, and they're like, this isn't what I thought it would be, but now I have to pay this shit.
You're right, and and especially, and I'm not gonna play a sad violin, for me, not at all, but we use them as an example, especially since post World War II, and especially 1960s and beyond. More people are going to college than ever had in the past, because there was an expansion, the ability to go because of a lot of funding. So a lot of people who wouldn't have typically or traditionally go to college went. But so, a lot of us, we went, and there's no like history. You see some people where their great grandfather went to this school, their grandfather went to this school, their dad went to the school and teaches there, they do. And so like when I went to go to school, Eric knows this, nobody in our family went to school, so it's like there wasn't like a nice little like, kind of like conversation of, hey, do this, don't do this. It was just go, and you just kind of have this naive confidence. I really did, which was, well, I'll just do this, and I'll just have to kind of hope that everything turns out. That was just kind of my naivety. And now luckily for me, it did better than others, but it's still, I wish I would have had more kind of information up front, because like Josh said, man, I can remember finishing undergrad. And if you had like a federal loan, you had to sign up for this meeting, and they put you all in this room and they show you this video that basically says that you can't like not pay your loan. The government will come after you. Like if you don't, they're going to send over a couple guys with a middle name, Jimmy the Fish, Joey the Bear. I mean, they're going to get their money. And I walked out there with my buddy Jason. I'm like, they're not fucking around, are they? He's like, no. So, I mean, you're right. And that's a good point, Eric. I thought that, but yeah, like an 18-year-old would have a hard time maybe getting a $50,000 loan, to start up a business. But we say, oh, you're going to go to college. Oh, well, here you go. Good luck. And like John Mulaney, the comic, talks about, he said he racked up $120,000. He goes, a choice I made when I was 17 years old without legal representation present.
As someone who is now in his 14th year of higher education, yes, this is a thing, and it's terrifying. But
You're like Van Wilder. You're just a
oh yeah,
professional student.
I'll graduate eventually. Hopefully, gonna graduate this. Yeah, but not with just my undergrad. Just so
he's more like Chris Farley and Tommy Boy. A lot of people graduate in 7 years. Yeah, they're called doctors.
That's right. C's get degrees. I have 2 degrees. And just getting this last one was taking me a little while.
I got 98.6 of them. College is a business, is what it is. I mean, that's what it is. It's a money making machine, is what it is. It's not really.
The more I'm in it, like I said, I've been at this school now for 8 years, almost 10 years, 9 years, something like that. It's my 9th year at this school. The admin got pay raises and stuff. I think so. Tuition's gone up every year, just about. But oddly, as a graduate instructor or part-time instructor now, our pay hasn't gone up very much at all. Maybe like $100 or $200 in 9 years. It's pretty remarkable. But admins and provosts, and we just keep creating these admin positions. Like we have a president, we have a provost, we have all these deans, we have vice deans, we have vice provosts, we have vice presidents. And then I'm sure we have other type of CEO positions or admin positions for finance and stuff like that. It's like, wow, you guys are really making a lot of money off these folks. And if college students really knew where their money went, I wish there was a breakdown of like, where does my tuition dollars go? Break it down.
Yeah, no, I really like that term. The inverted triangle is what they're calling that with administration, where you see all the growth happening at the administrative level. And again, I'm very happy in my job and where I'm at, but I had the same experience as you, Josh, because of just my position and the size of the school, where I'm at. Now, luckily, I mean, here, again, over the summer is that I received tenure and a promotion. So I will see an increase in pay, but that will be the first time that my pay has increased in almost 4 years. And even before that, the last 2 times that it had increased, it was less than 1%. So this, I'm very fortunate. I'm so glad to get this raise now. But when you calculate it over time, if there was like a 1% cost of living allowance, is that mine wouldn't even do that.
Yeah, so, but now you're untouchable. You have tenure.
I don't know. Let's see what I say on like this podcast as we go forward, and we'll see if that holds up. So
See how well your privilege treats you.
That's right.
Yeah.
We might have to kind of start like a GoFundMe or something.
Yeah. All right. So any last thoughts on this privilege thing, on this privilege walk questionnaire thing? I feel like we've derailed a little bit from it. There were I typed or I like made notes of some problematic questions that I had that I'm like, oh, well, that's not really telling me anything. I mentioned number 3 where it's talking about race specifically. And then number 6, it just says if you are a man. Period. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, what kind of man? Like, you know, am I a handicapped man? Do I have limited mobility? Am I disabled? Um, what are my options here? Just I'm a dude. Okay, well, that
Which
right.
is one of the
So
things that we had talked about at lunch the other day is what does it mean to be a man?
right,
So, how do you define being a man? If having a penis doesn't make you a man, if gender roles have nothing to do with being a man, how do you define being a man? So they put that question on there. I think it's a loaded question.
right. And if we're speaking about trans folks, someone who transitions to being a man halfway through their life, do they automatically get to take a step forward?
Well, yeah, they get that privilege.
Do they? Do you get male
I'm
privilege?
guessing.
That's I have no idea.
We
Number
need to-
13,
yeah.
if you believe that police would help you in an emergency, take a step forward. If you believe it, I do believe it. I don't. What do you?
I'm just better be quiet. I hadn't seen that question again because that's so loaded in the direction of that you have to have this view and experience that the police are inherently corrupt and violent and oppressive. So if you actually believe that they will help you, then you're part of the problem. You're part of the oppressor, and so you're excluded. I mean, built into that question is a loaded perspective. And so I just don't like that.
I feel
Yeah,
like
that's
a
what I
better
was saying
question.
earlier about.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Harry.
Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier about some of the questions on the take a step back is, if you feel this or if you believe this, like your feelings and belief, I don't think have anything to do with your privilege. I know that
Mhm.
they're saying that, from your life experiences, you're more likely to feel and believe these things in a less privileged life, but it's absolute nonsense because you are responsible for what you think and how you feel and what you believe. That's a personal choice. That has nothing to do with how you're brought up. Like I said,
I
I
agree.
grew up on every government program you can think of. I was super poor. I was on welfare and food stamps and free school lunches and all of that stuff. They called me generic Eric in grade school because I didn't have the fancy clothes and whatever. So yeah, call me privileged. I dare you. you know.
Yeah.
So just because I'm a
Yeah.
man and I'm white, they're like, oh yeah, you're part of the oppressors. Like, no, that's
And we're taking this back to class, like you said. If we're looking at this, if you want to do a privilege thing on class and you base this all on class, I'm 100% on board because you can see the matrix, you can measure it. And with this question, you're right. Do you believe the police are going to help you in an emergency? Well, what the hell does that mean? How are you going to measure that? How do you? Well, sometimes, most of the time, sure, I believe it. Do I not believe it? What if I wake up one day and be like, I don't really believe this today? Like, that's not a thing. I feel like a better question would be, do you have to wait longer than, I don't know, 10, 20 minutes for the police to show up? Have you ever been given like, oh, a police officer will be there in 45 minutes? Like, yeah, that's fucking scary. Like that to me is a measure of, okay, well, they're obviously not going to get here. Or you live so rural, you're of the rural poor that they're not going to make it to your house in time, or you live in an area where the police aren't going to be there or they're busy. Like, you live in an inner city and the police are busy and they're not going to be there in time. Like, I feel like that's an easier measure of class or something that's going to impact you greater than whether you believe it or not.
Josh,
Like,
that's a great point. It really is.
yeah. Like, how long does it take the police to get to you when you need an emergency?
Yeah, and what is the emergency? Did you drink too much and you're acting a fool?
Right.
The cops usually rush to that. So
Usually.
Now, but also, so Josh, one thing I want to say, especially as we come back to this in time, is that now to go back, because obviously, like even earlier, I have a lot of criticisms of this particular activity, but I think it's important to kind of point out, at least I think it's important, that again, like the spirit of it is something that actually I see some skillfulness in, because
Mm-hmm.
let's say, like, if you can, as people, as human beings, if we can find a greater capacity to say, hey, tell me about you. Tell me about your experiences. Tell me about your struggles and disadvantages, whether those are based on class, whether they're based on, gender. Guess what? I want to hear those, and I'm moved by those. And hey, how can we kind of work together to make a better world? So again, I think that there's an aspect of it that
Mm-hmm.
that is an important characteristic. So I don't want to dismiss that as I'm attacking the exercise, because I really do think that we are served well as people the more that we can appreciate and connect with the experience of others, and including being open and receptive to their struggles and having a compassion for wanting to help people and to right those. I think the main thing, again, like we're talking about with some of these questions now that built into them, the bad part about this activity is that it sets up this meta narrative of there are certain people that are screwed in the race and there are certain people that are cheating, because of these different things. And to me, that's the part, I am responding to, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. The underlying what do you call it? Like the implicit bias of the activity, essentially automatically assuming these things rather than looking at aspects that are quantifiable or like rather than, like Eric's mentioned, whether they're beliefs. There's one in here about that kind of echoes of culture. That's number 11. If your family taught you that police were someone to be feared, and I realize it's back in a police question, but that's a sorry, hold on. That's a question about culture. That's a cultural practice. That's a family practice. That's not quantifiable. That's not something we can examine. Just because your family taught you that, you may not believe it. Like.
Or here's the deal, but just because your family taught you that doesn't make it accurate.
Right.
It might sound harsh to say, but just because it was sort of the tribal wisdom that was out there doesn't necessarily mean it was true.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so it's hard to use these matrix as an example of stepping forward and stepping back. It's like, well, my family taught me a lot of bad things, but I chose not to believe them, or I chose not to acquiesce to them. So, are those steps back? Like, I was smart enough to say, nope, that's not how this is going to go. I don't know.
Well, and one of the points that I had made on the original Facebook post, like I said, I didn't get very much feedback on it because I think people are afraid to be engaged in it because they might, feel like they're giving the opposition traction. But I had pointed out that, you can't, if you can't uplift a group without doing it by standing on another group, then you need to rebuild the framework that it's built on. Because this whole thing is, we've got oppressed and oppressor, and you're either a privileged person or a victim. It's so one or the other that, they're trying to force people on, one side of the fence when it's, if there's an oppressed group, then work together and lift that group up. Don't do it by stepping on another group to raise them up. Don't try to make people look privileged, just to balance the scales. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree with that. Why limit the privilege of one just to but a lot of people think privilege, a lot of people think that power and all these assets are pie. So, if you obviously, if I'm going to get a bigger piece, you have to have a smaller piece. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that's the case. I think all like the rising tide, I'm more of the rising tide raises all ships kind of person, as opposed to, we're going to slice up privilege. Everybody gets an equal slice of privilege here, privilege pie. I agree. I don't think that's the case.
Yeah. Because can I mention something real quick? Is that I was actually making some notes last night, not even to this, but it ties into this. Because again, and that was a really good point. It made me think. Now again, like I said, I'm lucky because I really love my family and I've learned a lot of good lessons from them. I mean, I'm really grateful. But just like each of you, there's also things where I can point to and go, yeah, I'm glad that I was able to think about that. And guess what? I don't agree. I'm not going to repeat that. It's like you start to learn that you become have your own attitude, your own values, and things like that. And I was thinking about when we fall into this kind of reductionist group identity, whether that's based on ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation, things like that. It almost goes back to the pie chart. My question would be to ask people, well, then what percentage of you, if there is a you, is completely based on your gender, for an example? Because to me, what I kind of see is like all these different identity characteristics, I'm not ignoring them. They're each important and they each inform and shape who we are. And so they're important to connect with. But there's also kind of an us that forms separate from those, that is able to kind of, to put together experiences, thoughts, values that are informed by those identities, but are not those identities. And so to me, that's kind of one of those problems, but that's a point of hope, which is I don't have to be the class I grew up in. I don't have to be the family I grew up in, is that I can actually develop a sense of identity that is separate than that.
So I'm gonna volley this back to you. Well, that's just your white privilege.
That's
speaking,
right.
That you can
It
have
is.
multiple. But I'm gonna actually back that up and say that I think there is some aspect to that, and it's something we've talked. And going back to the idea of community versus individualism, and I've actually seen some critique of the Western European individualization, in the staunch individual ideology. And with that, you have some resistance from people of color, other ethnic groups, and also the LGBT community, because the community is so important. And so when we're talking about this idea of identity, yeah, we, as us dudes, white dudes or whatever, we have this notion that we are individuals. Right, we're FlyOverThinkers, sure. We're definitely overthinking the shit out of this one. We have this like staunch individuality to which we are separate from our individual identities, right? We're separate from being a man. Our sense of who we are, our sense of self, is made up of these things, but also outside of these things. Where I think people in these other groups might not see themselves that way. Some do, but if they're staunchly in the community and rely on the community for their existence and their sense of self, that being key. See, we don't have a community that's our sense of self. Our sense of self comes from within. So you have a group that relies on a community for a sense of self. They're going to use that identity as a core part of who they are. It's like that you always heard that, like, well, if you don't see my color, you don't see me. I don't know if you've ever heard that argument. And I think that's where that falls into. It's like, you don't see the color, the culture, you don't see who I am because I am so ingrained in this culture. Whereas white people are like, well, you're right, I don't see this color because you're an individual. That's how we think. Well, a lot of times that Western European ideology, we think in terms of individualization, not groupthink. Because let's be honest, when white people have groupthink, bad things happen.
Yeah, it's like, and that's and Josh, that's a great point, and I agree with you. So I think the only thing I would probably say, and I'm making a value judgment here, and I recognize it as that, is that I'm not excluding or canceling out the impact of like community or group or community identity. But like if we were to put them on the scales of individuality versus community identity, I think I give more weight to the individuality because other than that, if we look throughout history, it always goes back to then you are basically no more than, can't get outside of, or no more capable of your caste or your family name. Throughout most of history and most traditions, if you were born into certain circumstances, you were pretty stuck. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think that over the past couple hundred years, and one of the wonderful things about the Western tradition, and especially that individualism, has been that there is a you beyond your religious identity. There is a you beyond your tribe or your country. There is a you. So yeah, I don't think you're right. Taken to an extreme, which I don't think would be good. I don't think we should just say then that the collective or the group shouldn't be calculated at all. Because you're right, it should be. I think that's a great line. That people say that if you say you don't see color, then you don't see me because you're not seeing my group, my heritage, things like that. That's a fair point. But I think on the scale, long term, I got to give a little bit more credence to individuality than group identity, and because I just think it's a better script. I think it's a better intellectual script to orient around. And yeah, it goes back to, of course, I would say that because I am a white male of Western European ancestry. We're all stuck in that. So that's no matter what, we're not going to be able to say anything that's accurate as we do these podcasts because it'll just always be able to go back to, we cancel each other out. but does that make sense, John? But no, I agree with you. And that's a point well taken. Yeah, which is, I think that, because imagine, because even with all of us, is that, because I thought about this when I asked students to do this in my classes, maybe similar to what you do, Josh, is that, even though we might say we don't have sort of identity, but we do based on our identity to the Midwest, based on our identity to a little bit more of a country or kind of a rural, kind of way of being. I sort of have a sense of that, and that does inform me separate from those big city folks. So you're right. There are definitely some kind of group identities that I would ascribe to and value, and I wouldn't want to get rid of them. So that's a good point. But I think ultimately I kind of steer towards, eventually I think that the individual perspective has to weigh out, because otherwise I think we're just perpetually stuck in the cycles of reincarnation in like whatever group, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, now I'm curious. It would be interesting if you're talking about compassion, especially this idea of empathy too, that if you were able to put yourself in the mindset of someone who saw their identity through the lens of a community, how would you then, that in the community, the reason you have the community in the first place is because you have been historically left out of the dominant community or the dominant group. Then you do this this privilege walk with the mindset that you're part of this community. I wonder if that would impact the sense of like stepping forward and stepping back. And I'm wondering if that's not part of it, is that, looking at this thing through the lens of community, which makes up your identity, as opposed to looking through this experiment or this activity through an individualistic lens.
Yeah, and so that could maybe be some instructions that could be added to it that would make it more of a sense of maybe an exercise in perspective taking. I can remember going to a training once where there was I can't even think of it now, but it was an activity. It was for trying to help educators, try to appreciate whenever they're working with students that are coming from difficult socioeconomic backgrounds and limited resources. It was about trying to be sensitive to that and how hard it can be to sometimes, do the things and stay the way we say when, your life is on fire and, you're homeless and, you have to work 60 hours, it was stuff like that. It was a poverty simulator. That's the term, and you actually sort of went through and you were assigned different roles and kind of activities, and then afterwards, we kind of processed and talked about the experience, and there was some benefit in that. So maybe almost turning this into something sort of like that, as opposed to then starting to the way they do it. That might actually make it. I would be willing to say that maybe with that fine tuning, maybe there could be some utility out of this activity.
I feel like I go through a poverty simulator like at the end of every month.
Well, that's true.
All right. So what do we think? All right. Closing thoughts. What are your last thoughts on this thing? Wrapping it up. Eric, what do you got?
Well, I think if you spend time and focus on looking at things through a certain lens, if you look for certain things, you'll find them even when they're not there. So, I mean, if you're making a privilege chart, and you're trying to find privilege and trying to find oppression, I mean, it's going to surface because that's the focus that you're putting on it. That's what you're looking for. So I think, like I said, I like the idea behind it. I understand the idea behind it as an educating tool to get people to think, but the exercise itself, especially that chart, I've seen the video you were talking about too, and it's the same premise, but yeah, I think it definitely needs to be revised. It is a good, perspective teaching tool, but it definitely is rigged.
John?
Yeah, so two things that came to me. One of them was, yeah, I agree with you, because now I think the way it's done, and when you watch the video, what it's creating is you can almost see these people that keeps taking steps back, look at the people in front of them, going, "You oppressive sons of it's like it kind of creates that, and to me, that's sort of the opposite of what it could do. But actually, the thing that I would say wrapping up is, I think in our future conversations, something I'm going to try to do is to make a kind of a better note of, because you guys have each said some wonderful things that have informed and educated me that I thought were some great points. And I would say that because, Josh, there was something you said that I thought was I can't remember what it was now, but I thought it was a really important and good point. I mean, a lot of them were, but there's one thing you said, I was like, wow, I hadn't thought about that way before. And so I didn't write it down. So now it's slipping away from me. I think both of you.
Was it the police one?
Oh yes, it was that was it. The question of how long does it take them to respond? That's it. I think that's just a wonderful point that would be a better thing to measure. But then also, like what both you and Eric were saying, and we all kind of think about it, which is that we can appreciate the impact of these histories and heritages and identities, but then we also know that we don't have to always reenact them and play them out, because each of us have seen things in our own lives and in our own families that we've come to think about differently as we've been educated as adults, and we can kind of look at it and go, yeah, I don't think so. And I think that's kind of an important thing to remember too. So those were 2 points that stood out from our conversation tonight that I think were just kind of wonderful perspectives for me to reflect on even after we're done.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I've always had problems with these, especially that video. It's just the idea of a race, the idea of privilege is what determines the end game. There is no end game. End game is death. That's it. And everybody has it. Everybody gets there. But, and what we need to realize is there's stuff along the way too that wasn't discussed, that you're going to run into, that people run into along the way. Life changes. And that this idea of privilege at the beginning, I realize we want to examine it. It's important. I get it. But maybe we need to look at it from a different angle. I like the idea of class as opposed to race, because I think dealing with class issues would deal with race issues. Class issues are easier to study and easier to fix. Race issues they're not subjective, because you can measure certain things of racism. But again, racism as a concept is incredibly difficult to study. So it's easier to look at economic inequalities, class inequalities, and then apply them later after they're fixed or adjusted. And then maybe look at more long-term effects and long-term privileges and life privileges that happen later, and life privileges happened over somebody's lifetime. Because let's face it, there's people who are alive, that were born prior to 1965. So life has changed quite a bit. Also with technology, how much your ability to navigate technology is a privilege that's going to be more beneficial in the future. Hell, it's probably happening now. Older people struggle with technology. Is that going to impact their quality of life? Is that a privilege that they don't have? Like
My
someone who's
daughter
born.
actually helped me turn this computer on to do this podcast. So
Yeah,
Right,
Josh,
like-
I was going to say, listen, knock it off with this old stuff, because some of us that don't consider ourselves old yet still have to go to their wife who is the AV department to figure out how to do stuff. So you're right. I mean, not only access to tech, but a knowledge or a competency with it is a type of privilege that
Mhm.
I feel myself slipping in, just because of some of my own hesitancies and lack of competence in that area. And
Yeah.
you're right.
Yeah, I'd be interested 10, 20 years from now, how much this conversation or privilege around the language of technology is going to change the way we see social dynamics a lot. Anyway, well, awesome, dudes. This has been so great. I appreciate you joining me. We're definitely going to do this again. Oh, yeah.
oh, yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
This will be fun.
If you guys, for those people watching or listening, check us out. Hopefully you might see this on YouTube and post it there. Eventually we're going to post this stuff on podcast places, Spotify or iTunes or what have you. So, like and subscribe wherever those things are. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe, blah, blah, blah. We are the Free Overthinkers. We do have an email address, by the way. Not Free Overthinkers, FlyOverThinkers. FlyOverThinkers at gmail.com. That's all one word, FlyOverThinkers. But yeah, thanks for joining us. Hopefully you come check us out next time. All right. See everybody later.
Awesome. Good seeing you guys.